welcome to the short presentation on intellectual property rights management. My name is Nadia Dami. I'm Associate Professor at Newcastle Business School in the UK, and I'm going to kick off this presentation with a question. Why bother considering IPR management issues? Today, we are living in a world that is riddled with intellectual property rights and characterized by so-called intellectual property rights paradox. Large firms do it and small firms do it. So, meaning that the patents as the most recognizable IPRs are not just for big companies anymore. Yet, especially smaller companies are still struggling with the whys and hows of intellectual property rights. The paradox between the rise of IPR applications and grants on one side and IPR's suboptimal efficiency leads to the conclusion that management of IPRs, including their processes, is the key importance to the business success. So if we look at it from slightly different perspective, IPR management deals with co-creating ideas, reducing innovations to practice, as well as making money out of them. And I would say with the emphasis on the latter. Now, similarly, business process management deals with business processes that are viewed as a collection of activities that, on one hand, take one or more kinds of inputs and create an output that is of a value to the customer and on which firms can make money. So looking from this perspective, we are going to be examining or discussing whether IPR management with its processes has the characteristics of business processes. So now let's consider why intellectual property rights are different from other intangibles. We have examples of yo-yo, aspirin, zipper, bubble wrap, and so on. And it's clearly intangible goods and assets such as patents, trademarks, or even designs are different from tangible goods in numerous ways. While tangible goods have a three-dimensional scope or expression, the intangibles do not. This presents a problem when they need to be protected from third parties due to the difficulties in their protection. This also presents a problem that business people often have difficulties in assessing the value of intangibles. Now, the examples we have on a slide, they all started as trademarks, but then began being used as generalized terms. Hence, the companies owning them lost their trademark, either in some countries, in example of yo-yo, it's still protected in Canada but not in the USA, or overall. Let's think of another example, Google. So, trademarks are extremely valuable, even if you think about Google's trademark valued of tens of billions of US dollars. And if a task of IPR management and business as a whole is to exploit their intangibles as much as they can, then this generalization, when we use let's Google it, when we actually mean let's browse or search something online, is to be feared from the IPR point of view. So if we want to examine whether IPR process management is linked or has the characteristics of business process management, let's think about the following questions, or trying to find the answers to them. Firstly, are IPR processes really business processes? What are the inputs of intellectual property rights processes if we are thinking of them as business processes? How, if at all, are the inputs transformed into the outputs, and do outputs have added value? And lastly, If they do have the added value, who is the added value for? So here, let's think about what the difference is between IPR and other intangibles. The key element that we are going to be focusing on is the fact that IPRs are business assets. And in this regard, we have to look at two different perspectives or two different categories. One being business view and the other administrative view. Now, generally, the managers or the IP executives or R&D heads of departments would focus on long-term management of IPRs, and to do that with a view of their whole, meaning companies, IP portfolios. Now, IPRs are seen as business assets, as mentioned, but their maintenance is usually expensive. This, of course, requires efficient management. Now, a higher degree of manageability, and through this increased enforceability, meaning that they are more readily enforceable, especially when using IPRs offensively, is the way through which IPR management can achieve its goals and IPR costs can be justified or become justified. And in addition to that, what is often seen as a high degree of formality in IPR processes in comparison to other business processes, and is hence regarded as a negative feature, can, on the other hand, be harvested in a positive way as it allows a higher control of, as well as more structured processes within the company. So if we examine this part, so we said, we are discussing whether IPR processes are business processes. And if you remember on the previous slides, we said that every business process gets started with a set of inputs and gets concluded by producing a set of outputs that have value for the customers. So now let's look at it from the perspective of IPR processes. Now, here I need to mention, when we talk about customers, we have to understand this term as broadly as possible. And this means that a customer is basically any stakeholder that is in some way influenced by the output and is able to value the output based on the influence. So let's concentrate on the value for the business, as there are many ways how IPR processes can create values for the business. Securing the possibility to appropriate or maximum gains from the development processes being just one of such ways. Now, let's look at the two additional outputs that are generating value beyond direct customers, even though they're still creating value for business. The first being the donation of IPRs as the donation, as for example, the donation of IPRs within the pharmaceutical pools is very often mentioned. There are also trends of opening access to the IPRs of some big companies such as Tesla, Toyota, and so on, which is either done on a broad basis or to certain research entities such as Fujitsu. The value generated is that of positive signaling, new market creation, and potential further out-licensing. The second one also stems from the hoarding of IPR by big IPR-savvy multinationals, but regards the creation of value for society by matchmaking and simultaneously creating new services for third-party by IPR departments, meaning redesigning to the degree of their own business processes and by including services that do not really rely on the managing the IPR portfolio of the company itself. Now the flowchart that we see on this slide depicts a mid-level overview of a typical IPR management process, as the overall flowchart showing more detailed activities is very complex and broken into several sub-processes. The flowchart we are seeing aims to present the key links between specific activities and their flow, so we can see which activities are flowing either parallelly or sequentially. The process itself consists of 6 sub-processes that includes or where various departments are involved, employees, as well as external consultants. The first sub-process is IP creation sub-process, where IPR management process begins and where early harvesting of technology is at utmost importance. Many similarities can be drawn between these and flows depicting development processes and also development of stage gate model. The IP pre-evaluation sub-process, as the next one, a number of questions are answered in terms of coreness, crowdedness, alignment with product strategy, and IPR evaluation, leading to decisions on both market relevance, on whether or not to apply for a patent or keep the technology as a trade secret. The next sub-process is IPR registration sub-process, and this one is the most analyzed one, where numerous academics and practitioners tend to present their simplified version, especially of the activities that are directly connected to IP offices. The next one, the next sub-process, is commercialization or value extraction, that focuses on depicting various activities connecting to either using IPR as a negative rights or as insurance for freedom to operate or utilizing them in the IPR market. The last 2 sub-processes are enforcement and post-evaluation. The enforcement one makes sure that theoretical comparative edge of the IPR brings is not in jeopardy in practice. The second one makes sure that the IPR portfolio remains as active as possible, or in other words, that pruning the portfolio takes place. We can see also that the IPR process does not start without the inputs, one or both inputs that we see on top left side, and that the process always concludes in a specific output. So the IPR process does not run, the activities do not happen without the inputting or the input start, and they always produce some sort of an output. Now let's look at it from a slightly different perspective. Here we can see again the same, we're going to see as in the following slides, the same 6 sub-processes, but this time we are looking at them a bit more into detail. So not only do we have all the activities defined within specific sub-process in this tabular form, we also know who is actually participating in these activities from which departments. So if we look at the first columns, so the first column on the left tells us the business process, which is IPR process that we are discussing. The second column from the left tells us or shows us what are the sub-processes. So as mentioned, there are 6 sub-processes, and we're going to see this on this and the 2 consecutive slides. Then we have the activities that are listed within each of the 6 sub-processes. For example, if we look at the first sub-process, IP creation, We have activities such as invention capture, preliminary state-of-the-art check, acquire intention reports, internal invitation spotting, and so on. So basically we know step by step what activities need to be executed in order to get the information needed to see whether IP can actually be created, and this feeds into the next sub-process. Now, in the following columns, we have a list of departments that are usually included in this process or sub-process. So if we see in the beginning, we have IPR department, or in some companies it's called IP department. The next department that is heavily involved into this set of activities is, of course, R&D department. Then we have marketing department, sales department, business development department, finance, purchasing, legal department. Then we have top management, design department, operations department, and so on. We also included, so in the last column, we see the outside IP council. So these are the entities or actors that are important for specific activities within this process, but are not actually part of the company organization itself. So within each department also we have a bit more information. We know who needs to participate or execute specific activity. So let's have a look. Let's say activity number 2, preliminary state-of-the-art check. The actor or the entity that deals or that is responsible for this activity is R&D associate from R&D department. The square shows us that. Now, if we look at the row of the second activity, we also see that there are 2 highlighted cells with the letter P in them. One is for marketing employee from the marketing department. The second is for consultant from the design department. This means that these 2 actors or these 2 entities participate, hence P, in this activity and support the R&D associate when performing the preliminary state-of-the-art check, but they are not responsible for the overall activity execution. That is solely on the R&D associate. So this tabular form not only shows us the flow of how activities are connected one to another, it also shows us where the activities run in parallel or sequentially. It also shows us where are decisions that need to be made and what happens with the flow or the process once decisions are made. So if we look at the example of activity 6, still in the IP creation sub-process, the name of the activity is decision to evaluate. Decision is this activity, the responsibility for this activity lies in the hands of the IP coordinator from the IP department, and they decide whether the process will continue or not. So if the process continues, then the next activity, if we follow the flow, goes into IP pre-evaluation sub-process, IP portfolio review and patentability assessment activity. But if the process or decision to evaluate, the IP coordinator decides that this is not to be progressed, then the process concludes at this stage. So this tabular form shows us very clearly what's happening with the process, what are the exit points, what are the entry points, as well as who is participating and who is responsible for each of the activities identified. So we have, like I said, we have 2 sub-processes here, IP creation and IP pre-evaluation. We have additional 2 sub-processes on this slide. So this meaning IP registration and IPR, commercialization and value extraction. For each of these two sub-processes, we have identified the list of activities as well as who executes and who participates in this set of activities. So the actors and the departments are defined the same as in the previous slide. And finally, we look at the last two sub-processes, enforcement and IP post-evaluation. The set of identified activities within each of the two sub-processes, and of course, on the other hand, what departments and roles are actually involved in executing these activities. So looking from this tabular perspective, we can see very clearly, on one hand, how each department is focused, or how each department focuses their activities and their involvement with specific sub-process, but we also get a really good overall representation of what is happening in what sequence and how things can run in parallel in order to maximize the efficiency of the process itself. Also, there is clear identification as to what are the entry points, meaning where are the inputs that come into the process, as well as where the outputs are, where the process concludes. With this being said, I would like to summarize today's presentation on thinking about or focusing on maximizing the value from innovation, whatever intellectual property right in mind. And I think that's the key element of intellectual property rights management as such. Now, with my co-author, Dr. Dolores Moritz, we wrote this book entitled Towards Intellectual Property Rights Management, and we took to some extent a Robin Hood approach, where we were taking, meaning learning, from the big companies in order to offer it to the small ones. Now, the beauty of intangible assets is that through their use and knowledge sharing, the bigger companies are not weakened as a consequence. We also discussed how the constructs, the conceptual framework and the construct of IPR management is derived from practical insights in order to enrich the theoretical elements. Now, this book is quite interesting in terms that it highlights the gaps in the efficient IPR management by offering insight into practices that are used by top IP managers, as well as brings the tabular methodology, so the tables that we saw in previous slides, called tabular application development methodology, into the IPR process optimization model. So we were looking, those tables that we're actually looking at are called the activity tables or activity table approach. Now we use that in order to highlight IPR processes and activities. So if you have additional questions, if you want to see more examples, the book itself is very practically oriented. Feel free to browse through it or look it up online. And with this, I would like to conclude this session today. If you have any questions, feel free to contact the project's coordinator to provide you with additional information. Thank you and all the best.